1916. Millions were already dead, but in the First World War's third year, the Allies and the Central Powers move ever closer to total war, in the factories and at the front. The result was carnage. On the Somme, at Verdun, in the Alps, in Mesopotamia and Eastern Europe, as the great powers waged some of the longest, largest and most destructive campaigns in history. At the end of 1915, neither the Allies nor the Central Powers had achieved their goals. The Central Powers had smashed the Russian army, finally crushed Serbia, contained Italy, defeated the Gallipoli landings, and stopped the French offensives in the west. But Austria-Hungary had sustained crippling losses, and the Allies still had better long-term prospects to win the war. Allied planners met at Chantilly in December and agreed on massive summer offensives for 1916 on all fronts. The Central Powers, though, would strike first. The Germans discussed attacking in the east or at Salonika, but Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn decided it was unlikely they could knock out Russia, and the Balkans were secondary. The potentially decisive front was the west, and Falkenhayn chose to strike the French at Verdun. Verdun was the most fortified sector of the French line, with an extensive network of forts and supporting works, and formed a dangerous salient. To complicate matters, Falkenhayn believed that a breakthrough in trench warfare was impossible. The German battle plan has long been debated by historians. For decades, most accepted Falkenhayn's post-war memoirs, where he wrote that his intention was to inflict unsustainable losses on France, to bleed the French white. But most historians now argue that the original plan was more likely for Crown Prince Wilhelm's Fifth Army to take the Meuse heights that dominated the city, and possibly even the city itself, in a short, sharp operation. According to this argument, Falkenhayn switched to a strategy of attrition after the initial plan went wrong, and then lied about it after the war. If the Germans eliminated the Verdun salient, it would deal France a major blow and eliminate any threat to German lines and the town of Metz. Even if Verdun didn't fall at first, the Germans atop the heights could rain destruction on any French forces below. In the words of Falkenhayn and Prussian War Minister Adolf Will von Hohenborn, not even a mouse could survive. Beyond that, it's not clear what Falkenhayn had in mind as a strategic goal. Historians debate to what extent he and the other German leaders expected the French to collapse or negotiate after giving up Verdun or sustaining heavy losses in counterattacks. Partly, this expectation was based on many German leaders' ideas of the French national character as hysterical or emotional. It's also possible that Verdun was meant to be the first phase in a larger offensive that would be planned as the first attack was already underway. In early 1916, Crown Prince Ruprecht didn't understand how such a limited offensive could win the war. Falkenhayn isn't clear what he actually wants, and he's waiting for a stroke of good luck which would bring an advantageous solution. He wanted the decision in spring, but explained that a breakthrough was impossible. How else can we force the shift from trench warfare to mobile warfare? Fifth Army Chief of Staff General Konstantin Schmidt von Knobelsdorff and other officers wanted to attack on both banks of the river, since only attacking in the east would expose advancing troops to flanking fire. But Falkenhayn decided to attack on the east bank only. There's another historical debate about possible disagreements between Fifth Army and the General Staff. Operation Judgment was to begin February 12, 1916, using as little infantry as possible to save reserves, but supported by overwhelming artillery firepower. French General Headquarters, meanwhile, had decided that Verdun's forts weren't critically important as a siege defense. Belgian, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian forts hadn't done well earlier in the war, so Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre removed many of the Verdun fortified region's artillery and garrisons for use elsewhere, even from important forts like Douaumont and Vaux. Colonel Émile Drian, a local battalion commander and politician, argued in vain for better defenses. In purely military terms, French High Command felt that Verdun didn't have to be held at all costs, or even at all. What it could do was anchor the line as long as it made operational sense. So Germany planned to attack towards Verdun with the goal of removing the salient, but without a clear long-term strategic goal. It seemed the French might not take the bait, but that would change once the battle began. In January 1916, the German Air Force aggressively patrolled the skies above Verdun with 270 aircraft to prevent the 70 available French aircraft from conducting reconnaissance. The Germans brought up 1,250 guns, giving them a 2-to-1 superiority to pound French positions and suppress French batteries with gas shells. German guns would fire 2 million shells in the first week alone. In the area of the attack, the French had about 30,000 men from weak units to oppose the 60,000 Germans who would come in the first waves. Then, winter weather delayed the offensive, and several Alsatian deserters revealed the coming attack, which allowed the French a few days to prepare. Finally, on February 21st, German troops stormed French positions and Operation Judgment began. At first, they advanced cautiously, trying to infiltrate French lines and avoid strong points in an early use of stormtrooper tactics. Colonel Drian's battalion put up a determined defense of the Bois des Corps, which delayed the Germans, but on the 22nd, the wood fell and Drian was killed. Falkenhayn was optimistic. Sehen Sie, mit dem Angriff habe ich mal wieder das Richtige getroffen. See, with the attack, I was right again. Then on February 25th, German patrols reached Fort Douaumont, the linchpin of the French defenses, but nearly undefended due to a French command and control mistake. The few dozen French gunners present surrendered without a fight. German newspapers trumpeted its capture as a great victory, though several German officers argued for decades over who actually accepted the surrender. By February 28th, the Germans had advanced up to 8 kilometers, but then ran into trouble. Joffre now decided Verdun must be held, and he put General Henri-Philippe Pétain's Second Army in charge of the defense. The French rushed in reinforcements and stopped the Germans in their tracks. One of the French soldiers moving up to the front was Dr. Louis Maufray, who witnessed the evacuation of local civilians. In front of us, a long convoy of refugees in carts arrives. It's always the same misery. 1 or 2 horses in the traces, the cows tied at the back, the dog between the wheels. In the cart, suitcases, and on top of them, sacks, oats, hay, and the elderly, the kids, and a tarp covering it all. Most historians think that if Falkenhayn had allotted more infantry divisions to this initial offensive, the Germans could have completely taken the heights on the east bank. But now, the Germans didn't have the numbers, and the French did. Falkenhayn himself began to have doubts, according to Wild von Hohenborn. Falkenhayn is very nervous because of the impasse and heavy losses. Those doubts are not evident to Dr. Maufray, who experienced the power of a German heavy shell hitting his underground first aid post. The shock was terrifying. Those who, like me, were sitting were lifted out of their seats, and those who were standing collapsed. I felt a violent blow to my stomach and head. The lights all went out. The door resonated like a struck gong, and underneath was engulfed by a cloud of dust and burnt gas that seared our throat and nostrils. No one breathed a word. We heard the big chunks of earth raining down on the shelter above us, and then, after a long minute, the noise slackened. So after the dramatic German gains in the first days, they failed to take the eastern heights and found themselves in the very trap Fifth Army had feared. The Germans now held an untenable line. They didn't command all the high ground in the east and hadn't attacked at all in the west, so French artillery on the western heights could rain down devastating fire on the exposed German positions across the river. So the Germans attack on the west bank on March 6th. The French, though, stopped them again, this time on 2 hills that would become infamous for brutal fighting and horrendous conditions: Hill 304 and Moram, Dead Man's Hill. The shelling is so intense that by the end of the battle, Moram is 20 meters lower than at the start. The French High Command decision to hold Verdun was exactly what Falkenhayn later said that he had wanted, but it cost him dearly. Pétain quickly established a defense in depth and improved his desperate logistical situation. Thousands of trucks snaked along the road from Bar-le-Duc that became known as La Voie Sacrée, a lifeline that required constant maintenance by army engineers. This was one of the first instances of mass supply by motor vehicles and a foreshadowing of the motorized Allied armies of 1918. The French also built an extra railway line to supply the front, partly negating the Germans' earlier advantage of a much closer railhead. Pétain also introduced the Noria rotation system, which brought units out of the line before they could be completely destroyed. This meant that about 3/4 of the army saw action at Verdun, including future presidents Charles de Gaulle, Pierre Lebrun, and René Coty. The German Fifth Army, on the other hand, often kept units in the line until they were totally exhausted, with predictable effects on morale. The Noria system was part of the reason why the battle became a propaganda symbol. When it seemed like Verdun might be lost in the first few days, French papers downplayed its importance, but once the line held, the media equated its defense with the national will to resist. Pétain's famous order of the day, "Courage, we will get them," and General Robert Nivelle's "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became morale-boosting slogans on the home front. German propaganda found itself in a difficult position as the battle wore on, since the news of a great victory in the early days had raised expectations. Now German papers like the Kriegsecho focused on enemy losses. Our attack is progressing, with difficulty, but irresistibly. Verdun is an immense furnace where the best of France's strength is burning. The paper went on to say, the battle was like a Moloch eating France's children. For the men in the trenches, conditions were unimaginable, as hundreds of guns pulverized the relatively small battlefield. The wet winter mud was turned into a soup and trenches collapsed. The front line was often just whatever shell holes the men could find. This swamp was also strewn with tens of thousands of corpses. French soldier Hervé Lambert wrote home. A couple of lines from the trenches and mass graves where we are. From my squad, there are still 4 of us, out of 9. As to the view I have in front of me, it's overwhelming. Corpses are touching one another, piled up on top of one another, with a smell of decomposing bodies that sticks in your throat. It's horrific, with craters so large you could put a tram in them. I won't say any more. Medical services hardly functioned, and wounded often had to fend for themselves. Drinkable water was in short supply, causing soldiers to take deadly risks. We had to walk 1,000 meters to Fort Douaumont from a ravine. It was raining and mud was everywhere. One passed a water hole from which water was trickling. This corner was where earlier the village of Douaumont had been. But before you got to the water, you had to clamber over dozens of corpses. The French knew about the water source and shelled it regularly. There lay infantrymen, pioneers, all in piles on top of each other. Every one of them wanted water, but got none. So the French managed to stop a second German attack, which led French commanders to conclude the German offensive was over, as little more could be gained by attacking again. But the Germans weren't done yet. In April and May, the fighting raged back and forth, but the lines didn't move much. More and more units on both sides were sent into the inferno, and losses mounted. On May 8th, munitions caught fire and exploded inside Fort Douaumont, killing nearly 700 Germans in an instant. The Germans did inch the lines forward in spite of French counterattacks, and managed to surround the Fort de Vaux in early June. The French garrison was completely cut off for nearly a week. Fort commander Sylvain Raynal later recalled the suffering of his men. Men were overcome with vomiting, for so wretched were they that they had reached the point of drinking their own urine. Some lost consciousness. In the main gallery, a man was licking a small wet streak on the wall. Raynal surrendered the fort on June 7th, 101 days after the Germans had planned to take it. A major German attack on June 23rd made some progress and captured the ruins of the village of Fleury with the help of phosgene gas shells. The battle had raged for months, and the Germans had finally wrestled Morom and Hill 304 from the French, but still hadn't taken the Eastern Heights, a far cry from the initial plan for a swift attack. In early April, Falkenhayn even floated the idea of breaking off the attack. Certainly, it will then be said that we had not won the Battle of Verdun. But that is being said even now, and we can and must accept that. If we win the battle, our chances to end the war very much increase. If we do not win the battle, our final victory will be delayed, but not impinged, if we decide not to uselessly bite our teeth out at Verdun. On May 8th, he even admitted to the Kaiser that the battle had reached an impasse. Why then, since the Germans had clearly lost several teeth already, did Falkenhayn persist? Fifth Army Command, especially Schmidt von Knobelsdorff, reasoned they could still prevail and avoid the embarrassment of withdrawing. Falkenhayn agreed, partly as a result of wishful thinking and faulty intelligence. German reports wildly overestimated French losses, putting them at 525,000 or even 800,000 killed and wounded to 225,000 German by midsummer. The Germans misunderstood the French rotation system and thought that each new division they saw meant that the one it had replaced had been decimated. Falkenhayn was so confident after the gains of late May and June that he predicted the war would be over by the end of the coming winter. He even lied to Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg about German casualties. In reality, the French had only lost about 10% more men than the Germans. But German leaders had begun to lose faith in the chief of the General Staff. General Max von Gallwitz sarcastically remarked that at this rate they'd reach Verdun by 1920. Admiral von Müller wrote of the growing doubts in his diary. Great unhappiness with the Kaiser, who doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, and with Falkenhayn, who thinks everything is normal at Verdun. Falkenhayn tried one last offensive in July against the last French strongholds on the eastern heights, but it failed. Berlin removed him in August and replaced him with Paul von Hindenburg, who declared an end to offensive operations at Verdun. So after months of grinding death and the French still holding on to the heights, the Germans gave up at Verdun. But for the French, the battle wasn't over. The French High Command had also made changes. Joffre replaced Pétain with Artillery General Robert Nivelle in May. By late June, Joffre correctly concluded that German offensive strength at Verdun was spent and shifted forces north to the coming offensive on the Somme. For more than 3 months, grinding tactical fighting continued, pushing men like French soldier Marc Boisson beyond their limits. This is not heroism. This is ignominy. What kind of a nation will they make of us tomorrow, these exhausted creatures, emptied of blood, emptied of thought, crushed by superhuman fatigue? Boisson was later killed. German soldiers had it no better, like German-Danish soldier Jeppesen, whose mind played tricks on him at night. Suddenly I saw a monster right in front of me. It was standing and beckoning me to it. I could feel the hairs standing up under my steel helmet. I drew my revolver, flipped the safety off, and crawled forward. But when I got to the monster, it turned out to be one of the small ponies used to pull the carts. It had died here during an explosion and had been raised on its rear. Now all the flesh was peeled from it, and the moonlight shone through the skeleton. Finally, the French were ready to launch a massive counterattack. Heavy rain slowed preparations, but they brought up 650 guns to smash a limited section of German line with 250,000 shells. They also used innovative tactics, faking the start of the attack to get German batteries to reveal their positions and then hitting them with counter-battery fire, putting over 40% of German batteries completely out of action. The new rolling barrage, creeping just in front of the advancing infantry, kicked off the attack on October 23rd. French infantry showed much improved small unit tactics and were better armed with specialized close combat teams and more light machine guns. And the enemy they faced was weak. German troops were miserable, wet, cold, and exhausted from their long stays at the front. French infantry broke deep into German lines and thousands surrendered. French colonial troops recaptured Fleury and Fort Douaumont on October 24th after the German garrison left when 400mm super heavy shells smashed in the roof and started a fire. The French then took the abandoned Fort de Vaux on November 3rd. The attackers overran German William Hermann's unit at night, and as he ran from them, he fell into a large crater. 8 or 10 huge men rose before me, one with a rifle pointed at my head. I was still in a half-kneeling position. I cried, "Pardon, je suis votre prisonnier." Somebody drew back the hand of the man with the gun. I stammered in French, "I don't hate you. I don't hate anyone." And then I collapsed. In a few days, the French captured much of what the Germans had taken months to conquer. Then in December, the French launched a final offensive and pushed back the front line 3 more kilometers to a safer distance from the city. The Germans were just as incapable of stopping it as they were in October, although Generals Nivelle and Charles Mangin developed a reputation for wasting French lives. Verdun was now firmly out of reach for the Germans, if they intended to take it in the first place. Hindenburg drew a pessimistic conclusion at the end of the year. On this occasion, the enemy hoisted us with our own petard. We could only hope that in the coming year he would not repeat the experiment on a greater scale and with equal success. The longest battle of the First World War, the Blutpumpe of Verdun, was over. It had started with a swift German advance and French commanders choosing, as Falkenhayn later said he wanted, to defend the city at all costs. Why then did the German army fail? One problem was the lack of a clear strategic goal. As much debate as there's been about when Falkenhayn did or did not commit to the bleeding France white concept, there's no consensus that he had a clear idea of what this might actually achieve in practice, and his secretive communication style left others in the dark. He seems to have hoped France would collapse if he applied enough pressure. While French losses were higher in the early phases of the battle, the final casualty count was 377,000 killed and wounded for the French and 335,000 for the Germans. Terrible losses, but not enough to knock France out of the war. The Germans also overestimated their own abilities, especially the supposed superiority of their troops compared to the French, and they underestimated French resolve, skill, and strength. As the initial plan failed and the battle dragged on, the German High Command proved all too willing to believe unrealistic casualty estimates of French losses, since it confirmed their bias that they were winning the battle of attrition. Operationally, the chances of taking the heights quickly disappeared within the first week, since Falkenhayn didn't have enough infantry to push through French reinforcements. Falkenhayn himself also admitted after the war that not attacking on the West Bank from the start was a mistake. Potential differences between the General Staff and Fifth Army, if they existed, would not have helped matters. Crown Prince Ruprecht even pronounced the battle lost on March 20th. After a lovely early success, everything bogged down, and the operation so much as failed. Verdun can be considered from February to August to have been a tactical success for Germany, and from then to December, a tactical success for France. But it was a strategic German defeat and, arguably, a French defensive victory. France didn't collapse, and though weakened, still attacked on the Somme alongside the British and held the majority of the line on the Western Front. The German army wasted valuable reserves and fought a costly 10-month battle its leadership planned to avoid. Falkenhayn hadn't consulted the Austro-Hungarians in advance, so they didn't undertake any supporting attacks and eventually needed help to stop the Brusilov Offensive. At the end of 1916, Germany's strategic position was worse than it was before Verdun. Verdun also left a lasting legacy after the war. It came to represent the worst of trench warfare and the suffering of the soldiers in the minds of millions, and for many, the cruel futility of the First World War. French Lieutenant de Maisonneuve worried about the future. This war has marked us for generations. It has left its imprint upon our souls. All those inflamed nights of Verdun we shall rediscover one day in the eyes of our children. For many others in France, it became a symbol of the unbreakable national will to resist German invasion, to not let them pass. The battlefield is now littered with monuments, memorials, and cemeteries, and literature and film have turned to Verdun time and time again in the past century. After World War II, it even became a place of reconciliation between France and Germany. But future reconciliation was not on the agenda in 1916. While France and Germany were locked in the fight for Verdun, their Italian and Austro-Hungarian allies each launched their own offensives in the Alps. The Italian army was still in a difficult state in early 1916, nearly a year after Italy had joined the war on the Allied side. There were problems with food quality, training, equipment, poorly placed tactical positions, and morale, partly due to the excessively harsh discipline of its commander, Luigi Cadorna. Despite all this, they launched the Fifth Battle of the Isonzo in March. Its only success was a gain of 100 meters of altitude on Mount Sabotino, as the Austro-Hungarian positions were simply too strong. At the same time, the Austrians were preparing a major operation of their own, the Strafexpedition, or punitive expedition. Austro-Hungarian commander Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf wanted revenge against what Vienna saw as Italian perfidy, and he wanted a success of his own to prove his independence from Germany. The German High Command wanted Conrad to send troops to the east, but instead he gathered 160,000 men to attack 114,000 Italian troops in South Tyrol. If all went well, they could push far enough to threaten Venice and the entire Isonzo front. On May 15th, Austro-Hungarian artillery opened up, and specialized mountain troops led the way over the top. They broke the Italian lines and advanced up to 20 kilometers. They captured the towns of Arsiero and Asiago and were just a few kilometers from the plateau that led to the sea. Austrian lawyer Josef Redlich shared his joy with his diary. Wonderful advance of our troops in South Tyrol. 24,000 prisoners, 250 cannons taken, nearly the whole line from Brenta to the Etsch is now on Italian soil. What old Austria can still achieve after 2 years of war. Now even the self-assured gentleman in Berlin will be brought down a peg. Many in Italy feared that a major defeat might lead to revolution. Prime Minister Antonio Salandra tried to get Cadorna dismissed, but his government fell instead. Cadorna considered a general retreat to the Piave River, but instead shifted troops from the Isonzo and counterattacked in early June. The Habsburg army had missed its chance for a major breakthrough, as Conrad insisted on advancing on the plateau instead of racing through the valleys as his staff had advised. He also had to transfer troops back to the Eastern Front to deal with the Russian Brusilov Offensive, which started on June 4th. This failure helped spur the creation of a joint Central Powers High Command under German control, the very thing Conrad had tried to avoid. It also cost 145,000 Italian and 83,000 Austro-Hungarian casualties. The Austro-Hungarians expected things would be quiet while the new Italian government got organized. But Cadorna quickly shuttled troops back to the Isonzo front, where 220,000 Italians with 1,200 guns faced just 80,000 Austro-Hungarians. On August 6th, the 6th Battle of the Isonzo began, and this time the Italians broke the Austrians. Conrad had no reserves to spare and was completely outgunned. Strong points like Mount Sabotino, San Michele, and Podgora all fell to the Italians after fierce Austro-Hungarian resistance, and Habsburg forces abandoned Gorizia. This ground had been fought over for over a year, as an Italian officer observed on San Michele. Maggots, white and soft, wriggling towards the motionless bodies, penetrating them, feeding, reappearing in the empty sockets and half-closed mouths. Gorizia was the first major town the Italians captured in the war, and though it was a propaganda success, it changed little strategically. Soon though, Habsburg reinforcements arrived, the Italian artillery couldn't keep up, and the offensive ground to a halt on August 16th. It cost 51,000 Italian casualties and 37,000 Austro-Hungarian. From September to November, the Italians attacked 3 more times in the 7th, 8th, and 9th battles of the Isonzo. Officially, the goal was to capture Trieste, but Cadorna called these shoulder nudges to wear down the enemy. Italian soldier Antonio Di Nardo described the chaos of action. You don't understand a thing, but you intuit from the noises and whistles all around that things are not going well. You drop to the ground. The rain keeps falling, 1,000 snakes hissing in your ears, a confusion of people coming and going, deafening clamor. Then, solemn silence. But you have no clear idea what happened, whether you were cowardly or brave, or whether, turning back, you would meet the same officers and men as before, or another unit, or even the Austrians. The Italians didn't realize how close they came to a breakthrough in the 9th battle when a Habsburg regiment from the Banat region sealed the gap with a wild counterattack. These battles cost both sides around 75,000 casualties for nearly no gain. Italian morale suffers from the futility and Cadorna's cruelty, as he ordered subordinates to execute some men by decimation. An Italian soldier reflecting. It is not dying that is the demoralizing thing, the thing that grinds you down. It is dying so uselessly, for nothing. This is not dying for the fatherland, it is dying for the stupidity of specific orders and the cowardice of specific commanding officers. So the war had bogged down in the rocky peaks of the Italian front, partly because of the massive scale of operations in the east, where Russia won its greatest victory of the war. By 1916, the Eastern Front was facing a stalemate not entirely unlike that in the West. The deadlock was not as rigid and the East was still more mobile, but the fighting had developed into the familiar combination of extensive trench networks, heavy use of artillery, and strategic impasse. But that had not been the case the first 2 years of the war. The front line had dramatically swung back and forth. In 1914, the Russians defeated the Austro-Hungarians in Galicia, but the Germans had pushed back the Russians in East Prussia. In 1915, the combined armies of the Central Powers had driven the Russians back on what became known as the Great Retreat. Both sides then consolidated their gains and built elaborate trench systems. In March 1916, the Russians launched an offensive around Lake Narach in response to a French request to relieve pressure in the west. Although the Russians far outnumbered the defending Germans, the offensive was a disaster. 78,000 Russians were killed or wounded in just 10 days, and Russian morale took a serious hit. The Central Powers' confidence in the East, on the other hand, soared. Some German and Austrian commanders believed that the Russians were spent. But Chief of the German General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn knew a decisive push into Russia in 1916 was impossible. The Central Powers were still outnumbered almost 2-1, and there was no strategic goal in range that would guarantee Russian collapse. So the Russians started 1916 with a defeat at Lake Narach, but then the Central Powers began to fall out amongst themselves. Austria-Hungary and Germany were allies, but they were by no means equals. Both sides understood that without German support, Austria would have likely collapsed earlier in the war. But that didn't mean they agreed on strategy. Success in the East and on the Italian front in 1915 had boosted Austrian spirits, and debates raged about where they should focus their main effort in 1916. Falkenhayn wanted to push more resources against the French at Verdun. He believed that a decisive battle was only possible in the west. This meant that the Germans would have to move some of their troops to the west from the east, and the Austro-Hungarians would have to pick up the slack against the Russians. Austrian Chief of Staff Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, of course, felt differently. Conrad wanted to use Austro-Hungarian troops against Italy in South Tyrol and wanted German troops to shoulder the burden in the east. Both the Central Powers flatly refused to help the other and developed largely separate efforts. One bright spot was the addition of the Ottoman 15th Corps to the Eastern Front to help bolster the Central Powers' defenses. The growing animosity between Germany and Austria-Hungary was reflected elsewhere in the East as well. German staff officers like General Linsingen questioned the ability and spirit of Austro-Hungarian colleagues appointed through their dynastic links, such as the general of the Fourth Army, Archduke Joseph Ferdinand. Meanwhile, German General Hans von Seeckt regularly complained of Habsburg Schlamperei, or sloppiness. Despite German criticism, by 1916 the Austro-Hungarians' opinion of themselves had recovered. The incredible ease with which the Russians were repelled at Lake Narach, where the Russians had fought the Germans, not the Austro-Hungarians, had persuaded many Austrian officers like Colonel Rudolf Kundman of their own superiority. They attack stupidly in thick masses. They can do no more because they have no training. The Austrian Second Army diarist shared this less than charitable opinion of Russian abilities. The Russian reserves are weak mama's boys who immediately begin to cry when attacked sharply. Austro-Hungarian morale had improved, but the opposite was true for the Russian army. The Lake Narach debacle had also convinced many Russian officers and men that their German enemies were superior, but the country was already committed to a summer offensive. In December 1915, Britain, France, Italy, Serbia, and Russia met at Chantilly to develop a new formal policy of cooperation for 1916. The Allies all agreed that if one of them came under attack, the others would launch offensives to distract and drain the resources of the Central Powers. Generals like Russian Western Front commander Alexei Ewert and Northern Front commander Alexei Kuropatkin were uneasy with these arrangements. Their Lake Narach failure had been the result of a French request for assistance, and they were equally pessimistic about future offensives. Instead, they advocated going on the defensive while building up more heavy artillery. Some historians have suggested they often requested unrealistic amounts of resources to avoid attacking and potentially damaging their already fragile reputations. However, Chief of Staff Mikhail Alexeyev demanded offensives in accordance with the Chantilly Accords. That's when Southwestern Front commander Alexei Brusilov stepped up. Unlike his colleagues, Brusilov was confident Russian troops could achieve success if they were properly led, prepared, and trained. The intellectually inclined Brusilov also stood out for his willingness to promote officers regardless of social standing. Although Brusilov accepted that Russia still lacked heavy weapons, he nonetheless pressured other commanders into agreeing to an offensive. So he and Alexeyev created a new plan for summer 1916. Ewert would attack the Germans opposite his Western Front, which enjoyed a 750,000 troop advantage over the defenders. The primary Russian objective was German-occupied Vilnius, but 10 days before Ewert's offensive, Brusilov's southwestern front would strike the Austro-Hungarian lines to the south. Although the Russians only outnumbered the Austro-Hungarians by about 130,000 men, they hoped to draw German reinforcements away from Ewert. Brusilov's main effort would be made by the 8th Army towards Lutsk, but the attack would be along a 450-kilometer front to mask its true intentions and to create the potential for additional breakthroughs. Furthermore, if his 9th Army could make gains in the south, it might give the reluctant Romanians enough confidence to enter the war against the Central Powers. Alexeyev approved the plan, but made it clear to Brusilov he wouldn't get many additional troops or resources. According to Brusilov's memoirs, another front commander, probably Kuropatkin, approached him after the meeting with some advice. I was approached by one of the senior generals, who sat next to me and expressed his surprise that I sought permission to attack, and said, "You have just been appointed commander, and though you would be unhappy not to attack, don't risk your reputation, which is currently very high. Are you courting disaster, seeking dismissal and the loss of your military status that you have earned to date? In your place, I would be distancing myself from any offensive operations, as, given the current state of affairs, you will just do yourself harm." Brusilov had volunteered for an offensive, but he did not intend to fight in the same way as his less optimistic colleagues. He felt he'd learned valuable lessons from Russian mistakes, but also from the methods of the Entente and the enemy. Traditionally, Russian commanders tried to keep their offensive tactics as simple as possible. A lack of training among the infantry meant mass columns, sometimes up to 20 men deep, would advance on narrow fronts. Russian artillery use was sometimes unsystematic. This meant the defenders could concentrate their fire on the small number of breaches created in their wire, resulting in massive casualties for the attackers. Brusilov, however, reformed these assault tactics as well as the overall strategy of an attacking front. Instead of concentrating on a single narrow front, he ordered his commanders to personally identify sectors up to 25 kilometers wide for assault. By attacking numerous locations, the enemy would be unable to concentrate their reserves or recognize the true objective of the attack. When Russian troops achieved local breakthroughs, Brusilov could pour in reserves to expand the breach and roll up the flanks. Brusilov understood that his approach carried the risk of spreading out his strength. This means of action had, obviously, its downside, in that I could not concentrate at the main point of attack the men and artillery that I could have if I had established just one strike force. Since Brusilov himself wouldn't know in advance where the breakthrough would come, a larger strategic goal was tougher to develop. Instead, his goal was to destroy as much of the enemy forces as possible. To achieve this, Russian troops would use new tactics by advancing in 4 waves. The first, armed with hand grenades, would clear the first defensive line. The second, similarly armed wave would follow close behind and immediately attack the second enemy line. Once the second line was breached, troops in the third Russian wave would bring up the machine guns to prepare the area for a cavalry breakout in the fourth wave. Artillery would also play a role in preparing the battlefield. Applying tactics he observed from the French, Brusilov gave the artillery more sophisticated fire missions backed up by aerial reconnaissance. Once the guns had blasted holes in the Austrian wire, they would then smash communication trenches to cut off the front line. After each fire mission, observers would conduct assessments and adjust accordingly. Russian guns would no longer direct unaimed fire behind enemy trenches. Brusilov also noted that the Russian infantry started their attacks from too far away, sometimes up to 2 kilometers from the enemy's first trenches. Instead, this time the infantry would now dig hidden sap trenches into no man's land to within 60 meters of Austro-Hungarian positions. To keep these measures secret, the Russians adopted improved operational security and deception, including fake radio messages. Assault troops close to the front would wait unseen in large underground shelters before going over the top. The Russians even used the spoil produced by digging the shelters to conceal new positions and supplies. The new approach required rigorous training and higher expectations of the officers. Staff officers created replicas of Austro-Hungarian positions behind the lines for mock assaults by both infantry and artillery working together. For artillery officer Alexander Vinogradsky, all of this was revolutionary. The infantry practiced and adapted methods of attacking fortified positions specifically prepared for this purpose. We too had the opportunity to study the most effective means of providing support in the realities of time and terrain, instead of having to rely on probabilities. This mode of work, where nothing was left to chance or improvisation, was something new for us. Not all Russian commanders believed in the new tactics, including 8th Army commander Alexei Kalydin, but by and large, Russian morale and confidence was much improved. So, by summer 1916, Brusilov's southwestern front had undergone a transformation. Meanwhile, it remained business as usual in the Austro-Hungarian trenches. The experience of 1915 had convinced Konrad von Hötzendorf that well-entrenched infantry could beat off any Russian attack. In May 1916, he wrote a report in which he highlighted the powerful role played by strong frontline defenses, machine guns, and artillery in breaking up Russian assaults at range. In particular, he emphasized that the first trench should be heavily reinforced and occupied. Generally, the Austro-Hungarian front line was behind 3 belts of wire and consisted of deep trenches featuring overhead cover, fire steps, timber, concrete emplacements, and nearby shelters. Lines were spaced out about 50 to 100 meters apart, but although the front trenches were heavily reinforced, those further back were not. In some places, Austro-Hungarian rear lines were poorly constructed and, according to Brusilov, comfort trumped defensibility. Many shelters had been designed for comfort. The walls and ceilings were covered with boards or planks, and where possible, glazed window frames had been fitted. Some had portable iron stoves, and there were bunks and shelves. Officers had suites of 3 or 4 rooms with a kitchen, painted floors, and papered walls. The Austro-Hungarians also prioritized firepower in these frontline positions. The infantry now had more firepower, with 4 Schwarzlose M712 machine guns per battalion, as well as 90mm light mortars. The Austrians positioned their artillery just behind the front as well, to give it maximum range. Despite their strong positions, the passivity of the Austro-Hungarians created problems. Hardly any thought was given to active defenses, counterattacking, or withdrawing, while training had been replaced with digging and snow clearing. The front lines also became crowded. With 2/3 of their strength in the first line, there was little strength in the rear to prevent a breakthrough if that line was penetrated. The Austro-Hungarian General Staff failed to pay much attention to intelligence reports concerning Russian troop buildups, sapping activity, and intercepted communications. Konrad remained convinced that Russia lacked the ability to decisively break through. Vienna even transferred 4 veteran divisions with their heavy guns and ammunition to the Italian front, where they began an offensive on May 15th. So the Austrians were vulnerable in the east, but on the march in Italy, so the Italians requested assistance from their allies. Among the Russian general staff, only Brusilov was willing to attack earlier than planned. At the start of the offensive, Brusilov sent a message to his troops. "It is time to drive out the dishonorable enemy. All armies on our front are attacking at the same time. I am convinced that our Iron Armies will win the victory." The Russian summer offensive of 1916 began June 4th on Brusilov's southwestern front, followed by Evart's front on June 14th. The first Russian artillery barrages hit the Austro-Hungarian front lines at 4 a.m. Their impact appeared minimal, and soon after they lifted, the defenders rushed to the firing steps to receive the expected Russian attack. But no mass attack came. Instead, smaller Russian groups moved forward and probed the Austro-Hungarian line. Among them were Russian artillery observers who called in additional strikes which hit with more accuracy. Once again, the Austro-Hungarians ran for cover, and once again, they emerged afterwards to fend off an attack which didn't come. This cycle repeated several times on the first day, which demoralized the defenders. Soon, fewer and fewer Austro-Hungarian troops emerged to man the firing line. Only in the evening did the main Russian assault begin. Russian troops emerged from their sap trenches as close as 50 meters from the Austrian front line, often entering before the defenders came out of their shelters. The attackers captured huge numbers of Austro-Hungarians, as one new prisoner of war recalled. It was already 5 seconds after the artillery was no longer directed at the first trench. In the 6th second, perhaps a spirited defender cried, "To the trenches!" In the 7th second, he ran into someone on the stairwell, and under a low-hanging balcony that was splintered and torn to pieces, a hand grenade skidded after. And in the 8th second, a voice from above called down to the men in the cellar that they should give themselves up. All resistance was useless. Machine guns already stood in front of every entrance to the caves. The trenches had been taken. By the end of June 6th, the Russians had already captured 40,000 prisoners. Austro-Hungarian units did hold off the Russians along much of the line, but the Russian 8th Army broke through towards Lutsk, while the 9th Army made gains in the south. The Austro-Hungarians withdrew to poorly prepared rear trenches, only to be once again forced out by the Russians. With much of the Austrian artillery ammunition relocated to the Italian front, Habsburg artillery support was sporadic and uncoordinated. Austrian requests to withdraw flooded into headquarters, overwhelming commanders like Joseph Ferdinand. By the time he responded, units had already fled. Neighboring units who'd not been attacked also withdrew to avoid being cut off. Ferdinand's 4th Army fell back to the Lutsk bridgehead, a previously well-fortified position. But it was now in a state of disrepair and was overlooked by Russian-controlled hills. The Russians destroyed the position, sending surviving Austrian units back across the river. Austro-Hungarian command blew the bridges across the Styr before most of their men could cross, and 59,000 out of 61,000 were trapped on the opposite bank. On June 7th, the Russians took Lutsk, and by mid-June, they'd carved a 60-kilometer deep salient into the Austro-Hungarian line. In the south, Czernowitz fell on the 18th, threatening the Carpathian mountain passes into Hungary. The offensive appeared to be an unprecedented success. The Austro-Hungarian army lost 54% of its troops. Ferdinand's 4th Army was reduced from 117,800 men on June 4th to just 35,000 4 days later. Russian casualties were also high, but acceptable by the standards of the day. Kaledin's 8th Army lost 32,000 in the same time period. Conrad desperately called for German assistance, and they rushed reinforcements to the region. Brusilov's armies were on the march, with the Austro-Hungarians in full retreat, and the scene was now set for Evert to strike in the north. As June 14th approached, Evert complained of strong German forces in the region, poor weather, and a lack of artillery. He requested a delay until June 18th and eventually then July 3rd. Rumors began to swirl that Evert was afraid that his attack would not meet the unexpected success of Brusilov, which would make Evert look bad. With Evert delaying, the Tsar shifted priority to Brusilov's front on June 18th. What started as a diversionary attack would now become the main effort. Brusilov was outraged and later blamed Evert, Kuropatkin, and Alexeyev. I was well aware that the Tsar himself bore no guilt, because he was a mere amateur in military affairs. Alexeyev grasped very well, though, how the situation had developed and how criminally Evert and Kuropatkin conducted themselves. Had another military man stood at the head of the Russian army as supreme commander, Evert would have been dismissed without delay from his post for indecisiveness, and Kuropatkin never would have found a place in the active army. Brusilov now hastily added a strategic dimension to his offensive. Russian forces would attempt to exploit the 8th Army's success, capture the railway junction at Kovel, and push north to Baranovice. However, when they renewed their attack in late June, the Central Powers' defense was more organized, and German troops were arriving in large numbers. Although Russian units continued to advance across the front, casualties were mounting, and German counterattacks stunted their assaults. Still, the Germans were surprised at the tenacity of the Russian soldiers. Historian Rudolf Jerebeck commented on this phenomenon. Just to show the Pickelhaube over the top of the trenches was no longer enough to strike fear and horror into the Russians. German commanders now gained increased control over Austro-Hungarian formations. Archduke Joseph Ferdinand was relieved of his command, and German Major General Hans von Seeckt took over the Austrian 7th Army. The fighting went back and forth as reserves and ammunition dried up on both sides. When Evert's attack finally went ahead on July 2nd, it failed almost immediately. Attacking using the old Russian tactics, he lost 80,000 men for negligible gains, almost all of which the Central Powers soon recaptured. And Brusilov's commanders were abandoning their more innovative tactics as well. The new tactics required lengthy preparation and planning, which was no longer possible. In the push against Kovel, they ordered mass assaults, which led to high casualties and lowered morale. By late July, the battle entered a desperate phase as what remained of Russian veteran troops smashed against the Stochod line near Kovel. Although they did advance, there was no breakthrough. The Germans took advantage of Russian caution and launched counterattacks to slow the advance. With the men exhausted and far from their railheads, Brusilov's generals chose to consolidate their gains. In the south, progress was better, but there was no strategically significant target which would benefit the whole front. When Romania finally did enter the war on August 27th, it greatly extended Brusilov's front line, requiring him to divert troops away from his own offensives. Fighting continued until October, but it was clear by August both Kovel and the Carpathian passages to Hungary were out of Russian reach. The Brusilov Offensive is often considered the most successful Russian offensive of the war, and one of the most successful offensives of any belligerent. 400,000 Austro-Hungarian troops were taken prisoner, and the Habsburg Empire was directly threatened. But did the offensive actually have a significant strategic impact on the war in general? The Brusilov Offensive did have some tangible effects. The attack succeeded in terms of its stated goal, which was to relieve the Verdun and Italian fronts. The Russian attack forced the Central Powers to shift 30 divisions to the east. This likely contributed to the French victory at Verdun, but the Italians had already stopped Conrad's offensive by the time Brusilov attacked. Some historians have suggested Brusilov was a brilliant tactician, but not a brilliant strategist. His offensive lacked an overall strategic goal other than the destruction of the enemy. Historian David Stone suggests that Brusilov's broad front approach meant that he was only likely to break through in the least strategically important areas. Brusilov had prepared the rupture of the enemy's lines where it could be most easily affected, but this was the result of the inferior strategic importance of the points selected, and for this reason they could be expected to have been less carefully prepared for defense. In any case, the center of gravity of the Eastern Front was the German, not the Austro-Hungarian army. Brusilov's offensive did little to change the status quo or disposition of the two forces in the critical north. In fact, by bringing the Austro-Hungarian army under tighter German control, the Brusilov Offensive arguably made the Central Powers stronger in the east, at least in terms of unity and competence of command. Russian General Mikhail Belyaev appeared to understand this dilemma. The Emperor is as firm as ever in his determination to continue the war until Germany is compelled to accept our terms. But if our military position has greatly improved of late in Galicia, we have not yet begun to attack the German forces. Putting things in their best light, we must still anticipate a very long and severe struggle. But of course, it should also be stated Brusilov did not originally intend for his attack to be strategically decisive. That was supposed to be Evert's job in the north. Even so, killing and capturing large numbers of the enemy as Brusilov did can have a strategic impact. Morale certainly plummeted among the Austro-Hungarian troops, at least according to Russian reports. All Austrian officers, without exception, expressed their complete certainty in their own defeat and confirmed complete confusion in their high command. They also do not believe in the success of the German defense and are certain that the Allies are, however slowly but methodically and carefully, winning. All this came at a huge price. Estimates greatly vary, but to inflict possibly more than 1 million casualties on the Central Powers, the Russians might have lost around 1 million casualties of their own. The Brusilov Offensive was one of the most costly in history, but by the time it ended in fall 1916, the First World War was far from over, and in Russia, unrest was brewing against the Tsar and his generals. So Russia had nearly destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army, but edged ever closer to revolution. The Tsar's armies, though, spent 1916 attacking on 2 fronts, and their forces were not the only ones on the move in the Middle East. In January, the Russians attacked into Anatolia in the Erzurum offensive, smashing the surprised Ottomans. Russian troops entered the town of Erzurum and, with the help of an amphibious assault, took Trabzon. They inflicted about 65,000 casualties on the Ottomans and suffered just 15,000 of their own while gaining a regional victory. In February, Russian forces also advanced into neutral Persia, hoping to reach Baghdad and potentially meet up with the British. But the Great Link-Up never took place because the British were trapped at Kut al-Amara. After the Ottomans, under German command, stopped the British offensive in 1915, General Charles Townshend retreated his force of some 15,000 British and Indian troops to Kut, where Khalil Pasha's Ottoman forces besieged them. As time passed, the British situation became more desperate. They had food supplies, but Townshend made it seem like they had less to urge relief attacks more quickly. This meant that the British forces trying to reach Kut from the south between January and April rushed their efforts, and the Ottomans stopped them. British planes dropped a few supplies, the first time in history aircraft were used for resupply, but it wasn't enough. Both the garrison and the 6,000 Arab civilians in Kut began to starve. The British ate their horses, but the Arabs had nothing, as British Lieutenant Edward Moseley recalled. The Arab children make their appearance in groups, wailing piteously. Once the babes in their mother's arms used to cry the whole day long, but the unfortunates are probably since gone. The Arab population has been dying by the hundreds, and they look dreadfully shrunken and gaunt. The Ottoman troops surrounding Kut also had to deal with supply shortages and conflict with Arab tribesmen, which left soldier Mustafa Tutuncu feeling bitter. The Arabs behaved like anything but Muslims. Killing Turkish soldiers was a permissible thing for them. When I was a child, when the name Arab was mentioned, I thought that they were a nation superior to all other people. Now, I am filled with feelings of hatred. On April 19th, after 147 days of siege, Townshend surrendered after Ottoman commanders rejected his bribe offer to let the British escape. The 13,000 prisoners marched north for days, lacking food, shelter, and medical care. 2/3 of the rank and file died of disease or malnutrition during captivity. Many observers considered Kut the worst British defeat since Yorktown in 1781. The blow to British prestige, coming soon after the defeat at Gallipoli, made some in London worry that their Muslim subjects might revolt, so they resolved to strike back at the Ottomans. So as the British rebuilt their army in Mesopotamia, they also reached out to Arab tribes with a deal. Most Arabs did not identify with the Arab nationalist movement and did not question Ottoman rule. Others, though, were unhappy with Constantinople's policies of centralizing power, imposing the use of Ottoman Turkish, and suppressing Arab nationalist groups. One powerful leader, Hussein al-Hashimi, the Sharif of Mecca, also saw an opportunity to increase his family's influence by making common cause with the Arab nationalists and the Allies. The British promised military and financial support and a vaguely defined independent Arab kingdom after the war. On June 5, 1916, Hussein's son Faisal and Ali declared independence from Ottoman rule, and the Arab Revolt began. 1,500 Arab irregular fighters attacked isolated Ottoman outposts and disrupted rail traffic, while British officers, among them T.E. Lawrence, joined them. But the Allies also made other plans for the post-war Middle East in 1916. In April, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which planned to divide the region into zones of influence for the two countries, with Palestine under international control. The agreement also granted northeastern Anatolia, or Western Armenia, to Russia if the Allies won. All this contradicted the promises made to Hussein, but the Arabs had no idea, since Sykes-Picot was signed in secret. As the front lines shifted dramatically in the Middle East, the British and French began their biggest offensive of the war so far, the Big Push, the Battle of the Somme. French commander Joseph Joffre decided the attack in the west should come along the Somme River, where the British and French sections of the front met. Since France had a much larger army than Britain, French forces would take the lead in the joint operation. But in February 1916, the Germans struck first at Verdun. The French army held them off, but at great cost, and as the weeks went by, Allied planners were forced to adjust. The partly untested British army would now have to shoulder most of the load on the Somme. What was not clear is exactly what the offensive was supposed to achieve, other than relieving the growing pressure on Verdun. Joffre talked about a breakthrough past Péronne and Bapaume, but the French did not have enough reserves for it. British commander Douglas Haig also had thoughts about breaking out of the German system of fortification after wearing them down, but there weren't any significant communications hubs or industrial targets immediately behind the German line. Haig would later say his goal was only attrition, but this is still debated amongst historians. Other generals were more cautious. British Fourth Army commander Henry Rawlinson wanted to advance in short stages to provoke wasteful German counterattacks. The French Sixth Army's commander, General Marie-Émile Fayolle, was frustrated. Do they want to break through? What is the point of this battle? Attrition, they say. Fighting to wear down the enemy is not enough. I think that we simply can't stay inactive in the face of public opinion. General de Castelnau was more pragmatic, as he informed French President Briand that the battle would take the initiative from the Germans, spread out German reserves, and bring fresh British armies into action. The uncertainty stoked tensions. French General Philippe Pétain, in command at Verdun, demanded the British attack, otherwise he might have to give up the city, an exaggeration at best. The British cabinet worried about French recklessness in the face of losses. The French are short on men, but they want to do something to further decrease the number. The French worried that the British didn't have the stomach for a hard fight, despite their suffering at Verdun. What's disgusting is that the British don't give a damn about us. The Allies' method, at least, was more clear. The failed offensives of 1915 showed that infantry attacking without enough artillery was doomed. This time, the Allies planned to blast the German defenses with such weight of fire that the infantry would be able to advance with minimal losses. They would do so behind a creeping barrage to keep the Germans' heads down while the infantry crossed no man's land. Rawlinson wanted to focus the preparatory barrage on the German first line, but Haig insisted that British guns shell the German second line as well, and for cavalry to move up to exploit a possible breakthrough. The German defenses, though, were strong. They'd occupied the high ground in 1914, and many units had been there for a long time. They had two main lines of defense and were preparing a third behind that. The chalky soil allowed them to dig shelters up to 12 meters deep, protected from all but the heaviest of shells, and their barbed wire was up to 9 meters thick. Their line included several fortified villages and numerous labyrinth-like redoubts. German Second Army commander Fritz von Below planned to defend every inch of ground and retake any trench that was lost. Despite their strong position, the first German line was in plain view of Allied artillery observers, and they had too many troops in the vulnerable forward trenches. So the stage was set for an Allied offensive on both sides of the Somme, a battle that would see the British Army's worst day in history. On June 24th, the Allied bombardment began with a rate of fire never before achieved, over 2 million shells in the first week alone. It impressed, stressed, and sometimes angered German soldiers like Adolf Spemann. The superiority of the enemy is immense. The buggers want to wear us down and smoke us out using only their technical means. It's a lunatic way of war which money and America have created, simply to destroy everything and not to advance with a single man. The Allies were indeed superior. There were 26 British divisions with 1,300 guns, 467 of which were heavy, and 12 French divisions with 1,400 guns, including 732 heavies, and 309 aircraft. They faced 8 German divisions with 850 guns, of which just 18 were heavy and 104 aircraft. Some British troops were so confident their artillery had crushed the German positions, they expected to be able to simply occupy the empty enemy trenches. But others, many facing action for the first time, were afraid. Captain Charles May wrote to his wife Bessie, "I do not want to die. The thought that I may never see you or our darling baby again turns my bowels to water. If I die, know through all your life that I loved you and baby with all my heart and soul, that you two sweet things were the world to me." On July 1st, 1916, at 7:30 a.m., British troops went over the top, straight into a hail of machine gun and rifle bullets. The British artillery barrage had been spread too thin, and there weren't enough heavy or high explosive shells. Not only that, but perhaps 30% of British shells were duds and hadn't even exploded at all. The German wire was mostly intact, and German dugouts mostly untouched. Even the massive underground Hawthorne mine that the British blew brought little results. German troops came up from their dugouts and opened a murderous fire into the British ranks in no man's land. German machine guns and shrapnel cut down the inexperienced British units who walked towards them at a measured pace according to their training, and cut down the experienced British units who used more sophisticated tactics. In most places, the British didn't even get into the German trenches, and where they did, the few survivors were no match for German counterattacks. The Newfoundland Regiment attacking at Beaumont-Hamel, for example, barely made it into no man's land before it was nearly wiped out, suffering 86% casualties in the first 20 minutes. Only in the south did British units manage a reasonable advance, where they had the good fortune of help from French artillery. A British sergeant recalled a typical experience. "Away to my left and right, long lines of men. Then I heard the pitter-patter of machine guns in the distance. By the time I'd gone another 10 yards, there seemed to be only a few men left around me. By the time I'd gone 20 yards, I seemed to be on my own. Then I was hit." The French had much more success in the south. They had more heavy guns, had concentrated their fire, and were generally more experienced. They also had the element of surprise, since the Germans did not expect the French could mount such a large attack while holding at Verdun. They took the German first line on July 1st, then the second line the next day, advancing up to 7 kilometers and taking 8,000 prisoners. For a moment, it seemed the town of Péronne might be within reach, but the French didn't press their advantage, since army doctrine was now cautious and methodical. July 1st, 1916, was the worst single day in the history of the British Army. 57,000 casualties, with 19,240 men killed, among them Captain Charles May. The French lost about 7,000 killed and wounded, while the Germans suffered just 10 to 12,000. The reasons for the British disaster have been debated, but several aspects are clear. The shelling did not destroy enough wire or dugouts to suppress German defenders, and the rolling barrage moved faster than the infantry could follow. Some British units, though not all, as has become a widespread myth, advanced too slowly, and the men often went to ground once their officers were hit. The British home front was shocked at the scale of the losses, especially as many of the new army's community-based PALS battalions had badly suffered. July 1st had seen British failure and limited French success, but the Germans were under pressure. Both sides prepared for more fighting. Despite the German success, their commanders were still concerned as they had badly underestimated Allied strength. On July 3rd, General von Below issued a stark order. On the victory of Second Army on the Somme hangs the outcome of the war. The battle must be won by us, despite the momentary superiority of the enemy in artillery and infantry. For now, everything depends on holding on to our current positions at all costs and on improving them with small counterattacks. I forbid the voluntary evacuation of positions. Only over corpses may the enemy find his way forward. Haig briefly considered stopping the offensive and attacking in Flanders, which provoked French fears of weak British resolve. In a heated meeting on July 3rd, Joffre smashed his fist on the table and ordered Haig to attack. London worried that France would collapse without continued help, and so they attacked again on July 14th. This time things went better for the Brits, who after a 5-minute hurricane artillery barrage and well-timed rolling barrage captured most of the German second line. Some cavalry even saw action near High Wood, but the Germans forced them to withdraw. Over the next 2 months, the battle then evolved into a series of local British attacks, and both sides funneled in reserves. Given the Russian, Italian, and French Verdun offensives were putting pressure on the Central Powers, and Romania entered the war on the Allied side in August, there was some hope in London and Paris that Germany might crack. The British piecemeal attacks did inflict losses on the Germans, but they were disjointed and only began to shift the balance of attrition in September. Typical of the many smaller actions to capture tactically advantageous villages, woods, or important trenches was the South African Brigade's 5-day stand at Delville Wood or the Australian 1st Division's capture of Pozières. Many of the assaults failed or broke down into isolated small unit actions in the face of command and control issues once British troops left their own trenches. Still, the British superiority in artillery took its toll. The artillery thumps down onto our positions, shattering the ground and our nerves with it. Thankfully, the British infantry is useless. We can repel their attack with the help of just a single machine gun and a few rifles. But their artillery never stops. They keep pounding us day and night. I really don't know how we're going to survive. The Germans counterattacked hundreds of times to retake every position they lost and reorganize their armies. The fighting was bitter, and both sides regularly shot surrendering enemy. When one falls into enemy hands, no quarter can be expected. Everyone here knows this is the moment of truth, and the bitterness is extreme. Why take prisoners when one has to lead them back through the shelling? The British Army did gain valuable experience and practiced new tactics like better coordination between aviation and artillery, improved communication and logistics, more accurate rolling barrages, and aerial strafing of German trenches. They were slowly learning to deal with Karl von Clausewitz's friction of battle, what to do when your plan goes wrong or you cannot exercise direct control over units in contact with the enemy. The French, on the other hand, didn't have the reserves to exploit their early success, so they conducted smaller attacks to grind down the Germans. The much-awaited Somme offensive had bogged down into piecemeal fighting over the summer, but that all changed on September 15th with the arrival of a new weapon on the battlefields. The British had been working on a weapon to break the trench deadlock for some time. An armored vehicle on tracks they referred to as a water tank for secrecy. British High Command decided to commit its 49 available Mark I male and female tanks to the assault focused on the villages of Flers and Courcelette. Many British soldiers were as surprised as the Germans. Just before H-hour we heard an unbelievable racket, and I remember saying to myself, what the devil is that? And the tanks appeared, one in our front, one farther away. We were all absolutely stunned. We didn't know what they were because no one told us anything about them. It was a stupefying vision. The panicked Germans fled like rabbits. British forces captured Flers while Canadian troops stormed Courcelette and took it at the bayonet, a local but limited success. The tanks, however scary they were, proved not to be game changers. There were too few of them, most of them suffered mechanical breakdowns or got stuck before getting into action, and they proved vulnerable to German artillery. Some British officers felt an opportunity had been wasted by giving away the secret weapon before there were enough of them to make a difference. The grinding British attacks continued, with another large operation on September 25th bringing Thiepval under British control, an objective of the very first day. But as usual, there was another imposing German position waiting right behind it, in this case the Schwaben Redoubt. Parallel French attacks also made some gains in the south. For the men involved, like Dr. Louis Moffret, these minor footnotes of history meant a lifetime of trauma. Images of the Priez farm obsessed me. Bodies piled up in the sap trench filled with poison gas. Dead and wounded scattered pell-mell, the lack of water that even prevented us from washing our hands, the smell of blood, urine, and shit, the lightly wounded who crouched on the steps of the dugout, the dark masses of flies that covered the ceiling. I'll never forget it. Once again, the decisive Somme offensive had come to a standstill at the end of September. And once again, the French grew frustrated with what they saw as British hesitation. Joffre again pressured Haig to attack, but this time the British won't launch any more general assaults. They felt the troops were exhausted, and the fall rains have turned what was a muddy battlefield into a brown swamp. Smaller, costly attacks for tactical improvements, though, continue. The Canadians, for example, take Regina Trench after several failed attempts, but the 22nd French-Canadian Battalion is nearly wiped out. To close out the battle, Scottish units also managed to take the village of Beaumont-Hamel in November, yet another objective originally planned for July 1st. After 4.5 brutal months, the Battle of the Somme was over. It may have been the bloodiest battle of the First World War, and one of the most controversial. Casualty figures have been part of the debate. Today, most historians accept 420,000 British Empire troops and 204,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded, with German losses between 430 and 500,000. Some have claimed German losses were over 600,000, but this was likely to justify the idea of the Somme as a successful Allied battle of attrition. And the German army did suffer terrible losses on the Somme. Hindenburg and Ludendorff both said so after the war. Some have called the battle the muddy grave of the German army, or even Germany's Verdun. Despite the heavy Allied losses, the British could replace casualties more easily than the Germans could, and the British army learned much from the battle as part of its so-called learning curve. The battle did have an impact on German morale as well. Allied superiority in men, artillery, and aviation didn't result in a breakthrough, but for the first time many Germans, from regular soldiers to senior officers, began to doubt that Germany could win the war. Psychological casualties amongst the Germans tripled during the battle. The Germans concluded that although the battle was a Materialschlacht, what really mattered was morale and fighting spirit. But the attrition argument has weaknesses. The Allies lost more men than the Germans, and the Germans actually suffered fewer losses overall in 1916 than they did in 1915. The German army also grew in 1917, though it lost somewhat in quality. Although the Germans did stop their attacks at Verdun, they also still had the ability to transfer 15 divisions east during the Somme offensive to deal with Russia's Brusilov Offensive and Romania's entry into the war in August. If measured by the standard of Haig and Joffre's alleged desire for a breakthrough, the Somme was an Allied failure. They only penetrated about 10 kilometers deep and 25 kilometers wide into the German lines, and captured no operationally significant objectives. And when they did advance, they couldn't get through the German defenses faster than the Germans could prepare new ones just a bit further back. Given the Allies used 106 divisions on the Somme and the Germans only 57.5, it cannot be said that the Allies succeeded in applying their superior force effectively. From the German point of view, they'd prevented a breakthrough and stopped an offensive of 2.5 million Allied troops using just 1.5 million of their own. Even so, after the battle, General Haig declared victory, but not just yet. The enemy's power has not yet been broken, nor is it yet possible to form an estimate of the time the war may last before the objects for which the Allies are fighting have been attained. But the Somme battle has placed beyond doubt the ability of the Allies to gain those objects. The Battle of the Somme wasn't decisive, but the Allies failed to achieve their most important objectives. They did relieve pressure on Verdun, but they didn't break the German army by attrition, and they didn't achieve a breakthrough. The Germans, on the other hand, prevented a breakthrough and inflicted more casualties on the enemy while retaining their ability to move reserves east, a result that can be considered a defensive victory for Germany, even though their overall strategic situation was still bleak. The battle also had an impact in other ways. The Germans decided to prepare the shorter Hindenburg Line and to adopt new tactics to conserve manpower. It contributed to the removal of Joffre and Falkenhayn as commanders-in-chief. It led to Germany embarking on an accelerated arms-building program to keep pace with the Allies, and it began the age of armoured warfare. The Somme also marked the start of a much more important role for the British Army on the Western Front, and was the first time that British society was faced with the full horror of mass casualties of industrial warfare. That's why more than any other battle, the Somme still dominates British memory of the war more than a century on. So Germany had held off the British and French on the Somme, but its army was gravely weakened. Even so, during the battle it was able to spare forces to fight on a brand new front. Romania had a defensive agreement with the Central Powers, but did not join them when the war began. Its leaders were split between a pro-Central Powers faction led by King Carol until his death in 1914, and the pro-Allied faction led by Prime Minister Ion Brătianu. The pro-Allied camp argued Romania might gain the Austro-Hungarian region of Transylvania, home to many Romanian speakers, and so unify the nation. With Russia's advance in the Brusilov Offensive, they struck a deal with the Allies and declared war on Austria-Hungary on August 27, 1916, with the approval of Romania's new king. The Romanians fielded about 600,000 troops, but despite French and Russian advisors, they lacked heavy weapons and up-to-date training. The Romanian army crossed the border, and the Habsburg forces, already stretched thin on other fronts, were too few to stop them. Tens of thousands of ethnic Hungarians and Germans fled, and the Romanian authorities seized their property. The Austrian High Command transferred some of its Romanian-speaking units to other fronts for fear of disloyalty, but there was no mass defection. Instead, a scratch force of Austro-Hungarian units stopped the Romanians, and the other Central Powers sent in reinforcements. In the fall, two powerful Central Powers armies launched a two-pronged counter-offensive. Former overall German commander Erich von Falkenhayn directed the attack in Transylvania and the Carpathians, while General August von Mackensen led the German, Ottoman, Bulgarian Danube army against Romanian, Russian and Serbian forces in Dobruja. In Transylvania, the Central Powers quickly pushed the Romanians back into the Carpathian mountain passes. A German officer witnessed the failed Romanian counterattacks at the Battle of Geisterwald near Brașov. It was a noble sight to see these tightly closed ranks rush forward, recklessly contemptuous of death. Yet our artillery was so heavy, its effect so terrible, that this attack and also two others collapsed completely. Romanian morale was suffering, but they tried to hold their mountain positions. At first, they stopped the Austro-German advance, but in November, the Central Powers broke through. Exhausted and broken Romanian units tried to make a stand at Târgu Jiu, but German cavalry, superior Central Powers numbers and artillery smashed them again. A Romanian officer recalled the retreat. Enveloped on both sides, the men in the highest degree of indiscipline have retreated in disorder and could be held back neither through officers nor through gunfire. In the south, the Central Powers' advance was hesitant at first, but in part due to the aggressive moves of Bulgarian cavalry general Ivan Kolev, they soon break Romanian lines and defeat them at Turtucaia. The Romanians tried to counterattack across the Danube at Flamanda, but the Central Powers stopped them with the help of Austrian river monitors. The Danube army took Constanța in late October, but there were tensions within the alliance. Bulgarians and Ottomans, who had fought each other in the recent Balkan wars, were suspicious of one another, and some German officers were frustrated with both. The Bulgarians were drawn to rich Constanța, the Turks to Medgidia, the holy Medgidia. The Bulgarians must plunder, the Turks must prey. Romanian intelligence had underestimated enemy strength, and Russia provided little support, so the Romanians gave up Bucharest on December 9th. Before the Central Powers could take control of the oil fields at Ploiești, a British team destroyed the wells. The remnants of the Romanian army and fresh Russian forces created a new line in the north of the country, but Romania's gamble had failed. Elsewhere in the Balkans, armies marched as well. In January 1916, Austria-Hungary defeated and occupied Montenegro, and both the dual monarchy and Italy sent troops to occupy neutral Albania. Bulgarian forces launched 2 offensives and captured some Greek territory, since neutral Greece ordered its troops not to resist and Allied forces pulled back. The multinational Allied Army of the East under French command went on the attack in September, in part in a failed attempt to help Romania. After half a dozen battles, they captured the town of Bitola or Monastir in November. The 40-kilometer advance cost them 50,000 casualties and the Central Powers 60,000. The fact that the Allies were able to operate in the Balkans at all was thanks to their control of the seas. Until now, the main German fleet hadn't challenged the Royal Navy, but that changed at the Battle of Jutland. For most of the war, the German High Seas Fleet had remained in port, bottled up by the more powerful British Grand Fleet. In early 1916, the Germans adopted a more aggressive approach, intensifying the U-boat war and even sinking more cargo ships than the British could replace. The British fought back with new depth charges and aircraft, sinking the first ever U-boat by plane. But German sinkings of neutral commercial ships angered the Americans, so the Germans backed off and looked for action on the waves rather than under them. To weaken the British advantage, the Germans planned to lure smaller groups of British capital ships into battle and defeat them piecemeal. And one such trap leads to the Battle of Jutland, or Skagerrak in German, the largest naval battle of the war. On May 31st, the High Seas Fleet left its bases under Admiral Reinhard Scheer, but the British intelligence intercepts and decodes its orders, so the Grand Fleet set sail under Admiral John Jellicoe. The first clash came between 2 groups of battlecruisers in poor visibility and confusion, and the Germans got the better of the Brits. Midshipman Brian de Courcy Ireland was on HMS Bellerophon in a 12-inch gun turret. At one point, we were rung up to be told we sunk a German destroyer. During a lull, we came out of the turret to get some fresh air, and there, floating around us, was a whole mass of bodies and debris. Some of our soldiers were cheering because they thought they were Germans, but unfortunately, they were from our own warship, the Invincible. The Germans sank several British ships as the dueling battlecruisers steamed towards the main German fleet. Then the British wheeled north to draw the Germans towards the main British fleet. The 2 main fleets did come to blows, and despite continued problems with visibility and communication, the British even performed the difficult maneuver of crossing the German T. The British had superior numbers and firepower, so the Germans broke off and returned to port. The battle was a tactical German success. They sank 14 British ships for the loss of 11 of their own, and killed 6,000 British sailors against 2,500 German dead. British errors of command and control and flawed ammunition handling procedures contributed to the high losses. Strategically, though, the British remained in control of the sea and maintained their blockade. The German fleet would not venture out again until the end of the war. Across those British-controlled waters, the Central Powers still tried to wage war far from the main front lines in Europe. In early 1916, Germany declared war on Portugal when it allowed British ships to seize German vessels in its ports. And later, German agents blew up an ammunition train in the neutral United States to prevent arms shipments to the Allies. The most active theater outside of Europe, though, was Africa. In January, the German colony of Cameroon surrendered to the Allies, but in German East Africa, fighting continued. British and German-led forces, including native soldiers, white South African units, and hundreds of thousands of native porters, slogged through the bush. It's estimated that several 100,000 porters and local civilians died from disease, exhaustion, and hunger during the campaign. The Allies made progress in 1916 and pushed the Germans back, with the British and Belgians getting control of Lake Tanganyika in July. German General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led his troops on a fighting retreat, one that included harsh treatment of native Askari soldiers. Dr. Ludwig Deppe described an incident in October. This morning, 35 people ran away from the lookout point in Mtingi, so I had to put almost all the other porters on the chain. They all have iron rings around their necks, which are attached to a chain with 6 to 8 others. This is the only way to control the troublesome new recruits and guarantee that we can leave quickly if need be. The Allies had the upper hand in German East Africa, but the Bush War was not close to being over. As both sides strained to wage global, totalizing war, back home, planners pushed for more production to feed the armies. The war demanded a previously unimaginable amount of men, weapons, money, and materiel. In 1916, the war economies came online and production soared of artillery shells, cannon, and machine guns, but new weapons as well. 1916 saw the introduction of British and German steel helmets, the Stokes trench mortar, depth charges, and air-to-air rockets, among others. Factories also turned out advanced aircraft like the Sopwith Pup, Nieuport 17, and Albatros D3. More aircraft meant different tactics in the air as well. German ace Oswald Bölke published a new air combat manual, the first dedicated fighter squadrons and strategic bombing units appeared, and the British began escorting observation aircraft with fighters. Germany was so worried the Allies would outproduce it, Hindenburg and Ludendorff imposed a new ambitious armaments plan, although it's debated whether the new plan actually helped production. To compensate for shortages of raw materials, German trucks went without rubber tires, and women donated their hair to replace rubber industrial belts. The factories, though, competed with the armies for manpower. Britain introduced conscription in April 1916, while Germany and France transferred soldiers back into the factories to keep up production. Millions of women entered the workforce as well. 14-year-old German Pete Kur noticed the impact. The women are all at work in munitions factories because the men are nearly all at the front. When the women come home in the evening, they are too tired to look after the children. Grandma says that the women are an emergency force. Money was another emergency, and governments printed more of it than ever before and borrowed from everywhere, including neutral countries' banks or from their own citizens via war bonds. Inflation grew even faster than weapons production, especially in Russia. As the great powers increased arms production, melting plowshares into swords and church bells into cannon, the Ottoman Arabs were not the only group in revolt. In the UK, tensions boiled over into an uprising in Ireland. London had put off the question of Irish Home Rule until after the war, but several groups of Irish nationalists wanted full independence from Britain now, and rose up in the Easter Rising on April 24th. 1,000 rebels seized several buildings in Dublin and proclaimed a republic. We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the ownership of Ireland and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies. Standing on that fundamental right and again asserting it in arms in the face of the world, we hereby proclaim the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state, and we pledge our lives and the lives of our comrades in arms to the cause of its freedom, of its welfare, and of its exaltation among the nations. After a week of fighting, 20,000 British troops crushed the rebels, but the Irish independence movement gained support. 482 people, mostly civilians, are killed, mostly by British troops. In the Russian Empire, the army tried to conscript the previously exempt Central Asians of the Turkestan region as laborers. The Tsar's surprise decree came in July, during Ramadan and in the middle of the harvest. Russian and Ukrainian settlers had been taking land from the locals for years, and forced labor was the spark for rebellion. Riots broke out. In the north, the Russians crushed them within weeks, but in the south, nomadic bands of up to 15,000 rebels attacked settlers. St. Petersburg's response was brutal, and the rebellion ended in January 1917. 500 Russians were killed, while 53,000 Central Asians died and 220,000 fled to China. In Germany, some officers and politicians accused the Jews of not doing their bit for the fatherland, so in November, the government ordered a count of Jews in the army, the Judenzählung. This further inflamed anti-Semitic feelings, especially since Berlin didn't release the results. In fact, Jewish Germans served in a similar proportion to Christian Germans, and 12,000 died at the front. Jewish soldiers felt betrayed. What is this nonsense? Do they want to demote us to second-class soldiers, to make a mockery of us in front of the whole army? For this, we risk our lives for our country. Meanwhile, the German and Austro-Hungarian populations were going hungry. Falling food production due to labor shortages, hoarding by farmers, transportation problems, the Allied blockade, and a failed potato harvest reduced rations to their lowest of the war in Germany during the so-called turnip winter of 1916-17. Vienna was hard hit, partly because the Kingdom of Hungary limited food exports to the rest of the empire. Habsburg subjects denounced each other for real and perceived hoarding and profiteering, often blaming Jewish refugees from Galicia. German government later claimed 750,000 civilians died because of malnutrition and related diseases, but these figures and the blockade's role in civilian deaths remain hotly debated. Allied prisoners in German hands also suffered from shortages, especially Russian Empire prisoners who didn't get parcels from home. Alexei Zhukov confided his suffering to his secret diary. Hunger does not give you a moment's peace, and you're always dreaming of bread. We have to work pretty hard too, to the shouts and beatings of the guards, the mocking of the German public. I find myself thinking about ending it all. Such are the torments of my life in captivity. You have to forget who you once were and what you've become. As 1916 came to an end, the losses were staggering. Since the start of the war, Germany had suffered at least 2.5 million casualties, Austria-Hungary perhaps 3.5 million, Britain 1 million, France 3.3 million, and the Russian Empire 5.3 million. The Central Powers had survived their worst crisis of the war so far. But despite the unprecedented bloodletting, the Allies were no closer to victory either, as historian David Stevenson has observed. Nothing ever seen before compared with such massive concentrations of firepower and of human suffering in such confined spaces over such long periods, and with such meager results. In November, Kaiser Franz Josef died and Kaiser Karl succeeded him, just in time to see several attempts at peace fail. Newly elected American President Woodrow Wilson, who promised to keep the US out of the war, moderated in vain. Despite the death and the stalemate, both sides still hoped that 1917 would bring victory. Since you made it to the end of this video, you're probably a fan of detailed history documentaries. We actually produced 3 documentary series with a combined runtime of more than 9 hours. 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45 feature the last battles of World War II in Europe, and our series Red Atoms breaks down the Soviet nuclear program from its origins to the Chernobyl disaster and beyond. Unfortunately, we couldn't upload these series to YouTube, where we have to navigate advertising guidelines and the almighty algorithm. So where can you watch 16 Days in Berlin, Rhineland 45, and Red Atoms? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators. If you sign up at nebula.tv/The Great War, you can watch all our documentaries, including everything we upload to YouTube, ad-free and in 4K resolution. And all that for just $36 for an entire year. Nebula is available on smartphones, Apple TV, Roku, and more. A year of Nebula is also a great gift, by the way, and with the holidays fast approaching, you can gift a loved one a year of smart creator documentaries from us or other creators like Epic History TV and their incredible coverage of the Napoleonic Wars. Whether you sign up for Nebula for yourself or gift it to someone else, you will also support our work directly. Again, that's nebula.tv/The Great War for 40% off and just $36 for an entire year. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that is off to listen to the green fields of France.